Hello, my name is Steve Lerman, and I'll be giving a 15-minute lecture. And then what I'll try to do during this lecture is give you a broad overview about some of the innovations in the educational uses of technology. Let me first introduce myself a little. I am a professor at MIT. I've been here about 26 years. And I currently direct an interdisciplinary research center called the Center for Educational Computing Initiatives. This is a center that cuts across all of MIT's schools and departments and tries to undertake innovative research in how different technologies, computer technologies and communications technologies, can be used in educational settings. Most of our work is in higher education, but occasionally we do projects that go beyond that scope. What I thought I would do is first give you a little bit of a sense of some of the opportunities that we as a group have been exploring. And they really have to do about changing how we think about teaching and learning. And so I've shown a slide up here which contrasts two different ways of thinking. On the left side, as you look at it, are what you might think of as more traditional ways of thinking about educational processes. And on the right side are some of the ways in which we want to transform that thinking. So for example, we often talk about teaching, and I'd rather focus more on learning, what the student learns rather than what the teacher teaches. Rather than thinking of a teacher necessarily, one could think of an individual who acts more like a mentor or coach in certain settings. Students are really learners. They may not be students in the formal sense. They can be people in industry trying to acquire new skills. They can be individuals at home. We normally think of teaching as a synchronous process. You and I are in the same place at the same time while we're learning. When in fact, at least right now, we're not. I'm teaching this lecture or this piece in a studio here at MIT, and you're watching it somewhere else at a totally different time. So a lot of teaching and learning can be thought of as less as a synchronous activity and more of an asynchronous one. Too much of education, at least in my view, is passive. We put students in classrooms or in lecture halls in higher education, and we talk to them. There's been a strong move to changing that relationship where the student becomes far more active, an active participant in his or her own learning. And we also have gone very much from a scheduled learning, there are classes at certain hours, to much more ability to learn on demand, when you need it, where you need it. And finally, we often think of a set of materials for teaching. There's a set of lecture notes that we hand out to students, for example. And there's actually now much more interest in focusing on students working towards some goal. Now, no single transformation we're working on has all these attributes simultaneously, but they represent for us a direction that the research lab I direct is trying to head in. And I thought the best way to illustrate some of that was to talk a little about some of the projects. The work that goes on at the Center for Educational Computing Initiatives, CECI, really falls into three different intersecting areas. One area is enabling technologies. Not all of the technologies that we need to help people learn better are necessarily available today. And so there's some element of the research that looks at technology that can help students in different ways, things that enable ways of learning and teaching. A second broad area is applications, building real-world educational software and communications technologies and applying them with actual learners. Most of the activity we do in my center, in fact, falls into this area of applied research, looking at opportunities for how we might improve education, building things that help students, and then putting them in classroom settings. The third area is one might think of as evaluation or assessment, as it's sometimes called. And that really gets at the question fundamentally of so what? If the goal is to improve education, then one has to ask hard questions about, does a technology actually help? Do people actually learn differently or better or faster? And even that's not sufficient. The types of questions one has to ask really are much more fine-grained. Who learns better? What types of materials are better taught with a particular technology than by conventional means? How much does it cost, both to create the technologies and to use them? How does that compare with traditional educational settings? And so it's not sufficient simply to do things and argue and wave one's hands and say, well, we think that works. Many of the projects we do have fairly detailed assessment plans associated with them, where the goal, as best as possible, is to make some inferences about learning outcomes and how both students and teachers use the materials to effectively help the students learn. Well, with that, I'd like to tell you about a couple of the projects going on in my lab. Not all the projects are ones I direct myself. The first example I want to give you is directed by Professor Peter Donaldson. He is the head of the literature section at MIT and a Shakespearean scholar. And he's been working in a project based in my lab. He's directing this project for actually several years, which is an attempt to give students access as part of the educational process to a much wider array of materials that they can use to help learn about Shakespeare and his work. They call this project the Shakespeare Electronic Archive. And while I'll only be able to tell you a few things about it right now, I'd actually like to illustrate by a very simple example. One of the things that Professor Donaldson wants to do is to give students exposure to the fact that the body of Shakespearean literature, the plays in this case, which he focuses on primarily, is not really a fixed body. That is, there's no single authoritative version of the Shakespearean plays. In fact, these were living plays. They were plays that people performed, that Shakespeare himself probably changed. We do not have anything written in Shakespeare's own handwriting. That is, we don't know what he wrote. What we do know is what was published, some of it contemporaneously during his life. And there are actually multiple versions of some of the plays. And perhaps the most famous of all lines in one of the plays is from Hamlet. And in a version, the printed version, called the First Folio edition, Hamlet says, "To be or not to be? That is the question." This is the line that those of us who grew up in the English-speaking world all learned, and that was the way we all thought about Hamlet. But what Professor Donaldson tries to do is make students aware that there are multiple versions. And so what he's done is digitized some of the existing copies of the earliest printed work of Shakespeare. And so this slide you can look at now has the First Folio edition slide, and this is actually a digitized version at high resolution of that particular quotation from Hamlet, and then it goes on in the normal way. Well, it turns out that there's another edition called the First Quarto edition, which in its earliest printed version, actually predating the Folio edition, says, "To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point." It's a different line from the one that we've all learned. And what Professor Donaldson wants to do is explore the subtle questions about, well, first of all, which is right? Well, the answer probably is both. At various times these were performed. Why are they different? How did they come to be different? What might have happened? We don't know for certain, but what might have happened to lead to these two divergent editions? Now, if you look at the quartos and folio editions, there are many cases where there's significant divergence, not so much necessarily in a single line, but in fact groups of lines. The quarto editions are highly condensed. The folio editions probably come closer to the full play. But what he wants to do not so much is tell the students what's right or wrong, but stimulate a very different discussion revolving around these close to original source materials. This is the best that we have in terms of source materials. And so he's actually created digitized editions of all the plays. There's the full First Folio and the First Quarto, and actually there's another round of publications called the Second Quarto editions. He's gotten access to the very small number, some of the very small number of these that actually exist today, and he's created high-resolution digitized versions of them with permissions of the owners, and he uses those as discussion materials, and then he's carefully indexed those against things like the Oxford English edition of the plays. And so what he's created is a highly linked set of materials that can serve as the foundation for a very different discussion than would normally go on in a Shakespeare course. This is a screen that you'll probably have trouble seeing right now, but this is an example of the complete interface. You get at these materials through a web browser, and what I wanted to illustrate here, on the right side you'll see part of a performance. In addition to looking at the plays, he's digitized versions of the actual performances of the plays, focusing particularly on Hamlet. and he's been able to get access to a whole range of Hamlet performances, including some that aren't even in English. One of them is a Swedish performance. And so he's able to link the text of the plays to performances of those plays, and then compare how different actors have interpreted important roles. This then leads to a very different discussion, because a play is not a piece of text. A play is a living thing that is meant to be performed by actors in a particular setting. Different actors with different directors interpret the words of Shakespeare, to the best we can reconstruct those words, differently. And he wants to bring early in students' education this idea. Then finally, he's also brought together a body of thousands of pieces of art that relate to the Shakespearean plays. Some of this is contemporaneous to Shakespeare's time, the Elizabethan era, and then others are renderings of various plays in different time periods when they were performed, or pictures of different actors or different settings. And so he's able to bring to bear a rich, extensive body of materials to talk about Shakespeare with his students. Another project is something we've been working on, which tries to bring together a collection of film about modern China. When I say modern China, I really mean Revolution and later China. We've been working with a film company called Longbow Productions. Longbow is an independent documentary film production company that does perhaps the best independent documentaries about China. They've won many awards in their work, and they have graciously made available their complete film library. Not just the documentaries that they produce themselves, but the films that they used before they cut together the documentary. For every hour of documentary, there might be 100 or more hours of source video and film. And they've agreed to allow us to work with them. They, of course, still own the film, but to digitize portions of it and to then create on the internet various representations of that so people can search this archive. And we've been working with them. We've developed what I would call a prototype. We have not yet done a complete project, but I wanted to show you some pieces of this on slides. So one of the things we've done is created a searchable archive. And what we've done with them, and actually they did most of the work on creating these indexes, is created a two-tiered indexing hierarchy. There's a set of topic areas, things like actions, places, people, education, history, festivals. And for each of those categories, we've created a set of keywords. And we've indexed portions of their film collection against those keywords, down to small segments. So a single documentary might have as many as 20 to 50 to 100 segments, each of which was indexed separately. So this is the search screen, and so a user can put together a search across various topics. For example, one of the documentaries they did had a segment that went into a village, a rural village, and interviewed many of the older women who had, of course, grown up as young girls before the revolution. And these were women who had gone through the traditional foot binding that was not uncommon in pre-Mao China. And they talk about both the ceremony and the effects on them and how it was perceived and why they did it and what their parents thought. And these interviews are also translated. And so one might be very interested in studying that to understand pre-Mao, pre-revolution rural China. And these materials allow students to go in and look at those sorts of questions. Here is a result from that search, what we call a sample of the media. Every piece of media, every small video clip, and eventually every picture or image has a set of records associated with it. And this is a summary of the set of records. So the student gets a summary about the record, where it came from, that's what documentary or what part of a larger piece of film or video it came from. And then, and most importantly, they can watch that sample of media. There's a little video player on the right side of the screen that allows the student or the professor teaching from these materials to bring up those materials and show the students. So this allows the students to explore these materials on their own, asynchronously, to do research basically into these materials. Another thing they have done is created what they call tours. And Professor Peter Perdue has been working on this. He's in the history section of the MIT Humanities Department. And Professor Perdue has created from these materials what we're calling tours. A tour is an organized walk, basically, not a physical walk, but a virtual walk through a collection of materials. And so what he's done is organized subsets of the Longbow collection into meaningful multimedia essays. And so here is a screen from a tour we put together about Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square has enormous historical significance in China. It's, of course, the place the revolution was declared by Mao. It was the place for the pro-democracy uprising that most of us are familiar with. And it has a central place in the political and economic history of China. And so what he's done is organized basically an essay around the geography of Tiananmen Square. This is a highly stylized, on the left side of the screen, a highly stylized view of the square. And then students can move around through that, and as they do, they get segments of a longer essay that has text and video and still images. And so here, once they're in the tour and they're in the square, they can read this hyperlinked essay, which has text, and each part of the essay has links to various media that are also in the archive. In this mode, either the student can self-study, work on their own, his or her own, or often Professor Perdue will use these materials in the classroom and use them to launch a larger discussion about what the students understand from these materials. A third project I'd like to tell you about is in physics. For those of you who are not from MIT, all MIT students have to take 2 semesters of physics, all undergraduate students. And for many students, this is the most rigorous exposure to physics they have ever had. In the first semester of physics, they study what is basically, you might think of as Newtonian mechanics. This turns out, at the pace we teach it, to be a difficult subject for some group of students. And Professor Richard Larson, working with Professor Walter Lewin, who actually teaches this course many times, has taught it in the past, have been developing something called Pivot, which is the Physics Interactive Video Tutor. The Pivot project is an attempt to bring together a very large, highly interlinked set of materials to help students who are trying to learn Newtonian mechanics. And what they've done is they've assembled a very extensive collection of video and text and graphics and other materials, indexed them against the flow of the actual course itself. So as the course moves from lecture to lecture, each lecture corresponds to a set of keywords. In addition, they've done things like videotaped help sessions. Professor Lewin gives basically hour-long help sessions during most weeks. In a help session, what he might do typically is solve between 4 and 8 different problems that illustrate the key principles being taught that week. These are problems that look a lot like what you might have to do during your weekly assignment if you were a student in this course. So Professor Lewin goes through each of these examples and solves the problems and then talks about the issues and strategies in solving them and how they might actually relate to homework assignments that the students are trying to do during that week. The video tutor also has a couple of elements. But before telling you about those, let me sort of go through some of the hypotheses that we have and that we're now testing about why this subject is difficult and why these materials assembled as we have assembled them might be useful. The first is physics is difficult for many students. And so they need to have much more ability to go over certain subjects again and again. Ideally, they each would have their own personal tutor. And that, of course, is not possible with hundreds of students taking this each semester. Students who even don't have any difficulty, we believe, could learn in much deeper ways if they had access to a tutor who could present things in different ways to them. The traditional mode of teaching these materials, the lecture hall, we believe has very low what you might think of as bandwidth. That is, it tends to be a one-way flow of communication from the faculty to the student. It's highly confined. Students have limited opportunity to ask questions. The whole lecture lasts 50 minutes, 3 times a week. And so the lecturer is generally forced to move at a pace that works for the typical student, which tends to be a little slow for the very talented student and too fast for the less talented or student who's less familiar with the materials. Ideally, students ought to be able to navigate through this material in ways that best suit their own pace. And also, the reality is that in large classes, students have limited face-to-face contact with the teacher. They can go to office hours, there are recitation sections in smaller groups, but the truth is that for the most part, most students learn in a relatively passive way. Well, what Pivot tries to do is change that by providing an efficient, economical collection of very rich media. What we've done is we take these problems, these help sessions, we've digitized videos of all the lectures. There's about, in a typical semester, between 36 and 39 lectures. We have taken a textbook, one of the published textbooks, and created an electronic version of that. And then the most important thing to do is that we've linked all these materials together so they are searchable. In addition, one of our graduate students, Stephen Nimchek, has been working on agents, software agents, which is a category of software that watches what people do and watches what people say they want, and makes forward predictions and does things that would be useful for the student in this case, or whoever is using them. So one of the so-called agents, software agents that Steve Nimchek has developed, watches what students have used in the Pivot collection, and then combs through the collection and makes predictions about what additional things in the collection the student would find most useful at that moment. So, for example, if the student is looking at material that is very advanced in a particular field, say angular momentum, the tutor would look ahead and say, okay, I can find other materials that have a quality that they're highly advanced, that is, they're not more introductory, and that they deal with angular momentum. If, on the other hand, another student is looking through the Pivot collection and is focusing most of his or her time on the more introductory or prerequisite parts of the collection, the videos and other materials, then the tutor will begin to identify that as a characteristic, and at least for the next few sessions would be presenting possibilities that the student could choose that match those criteria. So for each student, the tutor builds a model of that student's current state, what the tutor thinks they know and doesn't know, and tries to present to that student options that best meet what the tutor thinks are the student's needs at that moment. So Pivot has a software agent that guides the learner. This agent keeps track of the student from session to session and offers advice to the student. The last thing I thought I would tell you about is a broader look at educational technology at MIT. MIT has something called the Council on Educational Technology. This is a council appointed by Robert Brown, the provost, and has been meeting periodically to try to help guide MIT in a long-term strategy for how to use educational technology. This has been looking at a broad range of strategic options. Basically, this is the place where MIT as a university tries to look ahead and to determine what things make the most sense for us as a university in the area of educational technology. And the challenge here is that this turns out to be an area where there are probably many more options than we should or could pursue. The problem and the wonderful thing, both the problem and the wonderful thing about new technologies in education is that it opens up a vast array of possibilities. No one organization, be it MIT or a public school or a for-profit university could possibly try all of them in any effective way. And so everyone in this field is trying to look ahead and decide, given the strengths and weaknesses of their organization, what small subset of the entire range of possibilities should they pursue. The Council on Educational Technology at MIT has been doing that for MIT. We've had help from a couple of consultants who've actually volunteered their time. McKinsey and Booz Allen and Hamilton have both been participants in this process. And what we've been trying to do is isolate a few key areas that it makes sense for MIT to explore intensively. Now, some of the challenges first are that the technology advances quickly, and students and professors have shifting expectations. The generation of students that are coming to universities today have essentially grown up with the internet. In some ways, they're the first generation where the internet has been part of their life in their formative years. For most of us, people of my age, the internet came later. It's something we learned later, but it wasn't part of our early educational experiences. Today's students, and particularly the ones arriving now in this decade, the internet has been with them. Most of them, not all of them, have had access to the internet throughout their at least middle and high school years. And so they're used to using it as a resource, for better or worse. Now, in addition, there have been several universities that have responded to these opportunities with a for-profit model. That is, they've spun off subsidiary units that, in some cases, are profit-making. And the question, of course, for all universities is, has this been a sensible thing to do? And for MIT, does it make sense for us? MIT has undertaken a variety of experiments in educational technology. But we really feel at this point in time we need some sort of coordinated strategy. What we've decided, and recommended actually, this is not a decision-making body as much as an advisory body to the senior administration of MIT. But we believe that MIT should use technology to enhance the core educational experience. And by that, at MIT, I mean a residential-based university where we teach relatively small numbers of students in intensive ways. That doesn't mean doing something different doesn't make sense for another university or another organization. But one of the key findings and recommendations of this group is that what MIT should do is leverage the opportunities technology provides to enhance what it's already doing. That we shouldn't become a global distance learning university with millions of students simultaneously, for example. That may make sense for some organizations. Certainly the Open University in the United Kingdom was founded on that as their basic model. But given MIT's core strengths and core abilities, we decided that what it made sense is to focus on two major things. And basically these essentially mean stretching certain barriers or certain areas that we're now working in. First, we should launch an enhanced version of our current research and development initiatives in educational technology. And what we have seen at MIT in the last year or two, since this recommendation was made, is a steady ramp up of the types of innovation, so the level of activity in educational technology innovation. And we now have far more initiatives, certainly many more than I've shown you in this brief presentation, and we've been able to get funding to do a wider range of things to explore different opportunities for improving our on-campus educational experience for our students. The second is something that's a little more subtle, and that is to find different ways to use technologies to basically stretch the boundaries of what it means to learn at MIT. At its extreme, one might think of an undergraduate education as a 4-year initiation into a lifelong club. Right now, students tend to think, I come to university and I leave the university, and for many of them, their sole contact is when they get alumni newsletters and solicitations for donations. That is, for many students today, the university experience is highly bounded within a 4-year interval. We're fairly convinced that that's not really the best model. That particularly for our students who are intensively involved over their lifetimes in engineering and technology, over about 2/3 of our students undergraduate students major in engineering, and roughly 20%, more or less, major in science. These are fields that change rapidly, and what the students have learned in their four-year undergraduate experience will be, to a large extent, outdated, particularly the base knowledge, the facts. Of course, what we really hope is they've learned a way to learn that will last them a lifetime. And so what we're trying to do now is to shift into much more activity to provide opportunities for lifelong learning. We've been working with our Alumni Association. We have a concept called Knowledge Updates that provide opportunities for learners beyond the four-year experience. We also have been trying to find ways to use technology to make it easier for students to be off the campus at various times. MIT has embarked on an exchange program with Cambridge University that will eventually have at least 50 of our students there and 50 of their students here. And part of what makes that possible is the ability to take courses. MIT also has a large program with the National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University, something called the Singapore-MIT Alliance that's using technologies. We've been looking at various options, 4 programs that we have now under study. One is these flexible educational options, lifelong learning I've talked about. We also think it's important to extend some of the computing capabilities we have on campus to the larger community of learners. And they have a variety of things that we have been planning and working on to find ways to extend out the digital infrastructure of the university, the libraries, and other digital resources. It turns out there's a lot of complexity that is both technological in nature, what happens when we have 10 times as many people who are part of our digital community as we have now, and also, frankly, legal and economic. The libraries, for example, have licenses for a variety of digital materials, not all of which can be provided outside the campus because of the licensing agreements we have with various providers of those resources. Well, in the class session that I'll be giving, in Professor Miyagawa's course, I will be talking more about these and others, and I hope to stimulate a discussion. If you want more information, on the slide is my contact information, and you can contact me. And when we do have the class, I hope to have an active and interesting and lively discussion about some of these issues. Look forward to talking to you.